On the morning of October 17, 1346, an army of thousands marched under the grey sky of Durham with the certainty of those who believe they have calculated everything. The King of Scotland advanced southward, convinced that England lay empty, exhausted by its own wars, unable to respond. Scottish spears glinted in the autumn cold. Drums resounded, the road seemed open. But what awaited them was not a defenseless land. It was not the void they had been promised. It was an army gathered in silence, organized by hands that knew danger better than anyone, stationed on the hills west of Durham, waiting. And when the Scots advanced toward the ridge of Neville's Cross, the air was torn apart. Arrows fell first, thick, incessant, invisible, until they bit into flesh and metal. Formations broke, the flanks collapsed one after another. The men who were supposed to protect the king's right flank fled without looking back. And when the King of Scotland tried to escape, wounded in the face by 2 arrows, only 40 men remained by his side. As the sun began to set over Durham, a king lay in chains under a stone bridge, discovered by his own reflection in the river. Scotland, in a single afternoon, had lost its monarch, its nobility, and its future. The echo of that day would cross the centuries. To understand how Scotland reached that point, one must go back several decades. The kingdom north of the River Tweed had fought an almost continuous war for its survival since the year 1296, when English claims to the Scottish throne ignited a flame that would take generations to extinguish. It was the war that forged legends: William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, Bannockburn. It was the war that convinced the Scots they could resist the most powerful kingdom in the British Isles. But legends do not last forever, and the glory of Bannockburn, won in 1314, had already faded considerably when David II, son of the great Robert the Bruce, took the throne in 1329 at just 5 years of age. What followed was a childhood marked by chaos. The English faction supported Edward Balliol as a rival pretender to the Scottish throne. Invasions followed one another. The court was forced to flee. At 7 years old, the young king was sent to France, where he remained exiled at Château Gaillard for 7 years, far from his kingdom, learning the refinements of the French court while Scotland fought alone. He returned in 1341, at 17, to a kingdom that was still bleeding. In that same year of 1346, the European chessboard was radically transformed. Edward III of England had crossed the English Channel, crushed the French at Crécy in August, and laid siege to the port city of Calais. France was in crisis, and King Philip VI, desperate, turned to the Old Alliance, the treaty that had bound Scotland and France for generations, under the premise that the enemy of an enemy was an ally. Philip VI wrote to David II with urgency: "Invade England, open a front in the north, force Edward to divide his forces." The French king painted the north of England as a defenseless void, a land of priests and old men, stripped of its men of war by the English king's ambitions on the continent. It was a tempting invitation, and David II, young, ambitious, eager to prove he was the worthy heir to the man who had won Bannockburn, accepted it. It was not a simple decision. There were voices advising caution. Memories of Halidon Hill in 1333, when the Scots had been massacred by English archers, still weighed on the collective memory. But Philip II's pressure was constant, and David II's confidence in his own political star ultimately prevailed over prudence. On the 1st of October 1346, the Scottish army began to gather at the borders. Several thousand men from every corner of the kingdom converged under the king's banners. What they did not know was that Edward III, far from being a careless monarch, had foreseen exactly that possibility. Before crossing the Channel, the English king had left precise instructions for the defense of the north. The north of England was not empty. It was waiting. David II of Scotland was 22 years old when he crossed the border. He was a man with features that vaguely recalled his father. Though without the imposing physical presence, that chronicles attributed to the great Robert the Bruce. His childhood in France had given him courtly manners, but real war, the kind decided in the mud among men who have killed before, was less familiar territory. He had courage. No one could deny him that. The chronicles agree that David fought personally in the battle, that he did not flee at the first sign of danger, and that he continued commanding even after receiving his first wounds. But courage without tactical skill can be as fatal as cowardice. And in David II, there was a deeper wound, invisible under his armor, the constant shadow of his father. Robert the Bruce had built Scottish independence with blood, patience, and a tactical intelligence that astounded his contemporaries. His son had grown up in exile, listening to stories about a father who had become a legend. Perhaps it was that desire to prove himself, to write his own page of glory, that led him to ignore the warnings of those who saw the danger more clearly. On the English side, the dominant figure was an archbishop. William Zouche, Archbishop of York, was the man who, in Edward III's absence, became the linchpin of the defense of northern England. He was not a conventional warrior, but he was a brilliant administrator and a relentless organizer. Beside him, Ralph Neville, Lord of the Northeastern Lands, was the warrior heart of the English response. The Neville's were a family forged in border wars, knowing every hill and every ford of the territory. Ralph Neville did not need anyone to explain his adversary's tactics. He had known them from birth. And when he chose the position where he would wait for the Scots, he chose with the instinct of one who has spent his entire life reading the battlefield. Henry Percy completed the triumvirate. Together, the three men built the trap. And then there was Robert Stewart, nephew of the Scottish king and heir presumptive to the throne of Scotland. Politically calculating and shrewd, Stewart commanded one of the three divisions of the Scottish army. He was the man in whom David II placed much of his trust. No one could have predicted, on the morning of October 17th, that this same man would be the one to abandon the king at the worst moment of the battle. The Scottish army crossed the border on October 7th with the momentum of those fulfilling a destiny. David II advanced through Liddesdale, collecting tributes and sowing terror in his path. In Hexham, the Scots showed no mercy. The abbey was sacked. The monks fled. Fire followed the army southward like a second vanguard. The fields burned. Smoke was visible from the hills surrounding Durham. On October 16th, the Scottish army arrived at the city gates. Its cathedral housed the relics of St. Cuthbert, patron of the North, and was a center of religious power of the first magnitude. The monks of Durham negotiated. They offered £1,000 to protect their religious foundation. David II accepted, and they agreed that payment would be made the following day. It was a decision that would cost them dearly, because that same afternoon, while the Scots camped confidently a few miles away, the English army finished gathering in silence. William Zouche had acted with a precision that would completely debunk the image of a defenseless northern England. He gathered thousands of soldiers hardened by years of border life. Ralph Neville provided his cavalry and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Henry Percy arrived with his men. English spies had followed every Scottish movement. Zouche knew exactly where they were, how many they were, and what their intention was. He carefully chose the ground where he would give battle, the hills west of Durham, dominated by an ancient Anglo-Saxon stone cross that locals called Neville's's cross. The slopes were crossed by deep ravines, narrow valleys, and natural obstructions that would make the movement of a large army extremely difficult. For the English archers, it was a decisive advantage. For the Scottish divisions, it would be a deadly labyrinth. On the morning of October 17th, the Scots discovered too late that the English were there. The discovery was the work of William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale, one of the most feared guerrillas of the borders. His scouts informed the king of the presence of an organized English force on the hills to the west. David II, instead of retreating or seeking more favorable ground, ordered the advance toward the ridge. He wanted the high ground. What he did not see, or did not want to see, was that the ravines between his army and the English would make any coherent maneuver impossible once the combat began. The Scottish army was organized into 3 divisions. On the right, Robert Stewart and the Earl of March. In the center, David II himself with his best men. On the left, the Earl of Moray. Facing them, in an equally divided formation, the English waited. And they waited. The Scots also waited. For hours, the 2 armies watched each other from their positions, neither willing to be the first to cross the difficult terrain that separated them. The October cold seeped into the bones of the men on both sides. Durham Cathedral could be seen in the distance, its towers pointing toward a sky that promised nothing. It was at noon when English patience transformed into calculated action. The archers advanced first. It was not a charge, not a massive assault. It was a deliberate and precise provocation. Groups of archers approached the Scottish lines, loosed their first arrows, and then fell back. The goal was not to destroy the enemy from a distance, though that also happened. The goal was to force the Scots to move, and it worked. Arrows bit into the flanks of the formations with lethal precision. Men fell. Shields were not enough against those longbows that could pierce armor at distances that seemed impossible. Scottish discipline, solid during hours of tense waiting, began to crack. David II made the decision his more prudent advisors would have wanted to avoid. He ordered the advance. The 3 divisions began to move forward at the same time. On paper, it was a coordinated maneuver. In the reality of the terrain, it was a progressive catastrophe. The left division, commanded by the Earl of Moray, was the first to encounter the ravines. Men marching in compact formation found themselves trying to descend irregular slopes while arrows continued to fall. Order broke. Those advancing collided with those stumbling. The left division reached the English not as a unified blow, but as a disordered mass of exhausted men, and it was destroyed with brutal efficiency. The right division, under Robert Stewart, had its own problems. The English archers concentrated a significant part of their forces on that wing, and at some point in that chaos of dust and arrows and commands that no one could hear, Robert Stewart made his own decision. He abandoned the field. The heir to the Scottish throne, the king's nephew, fled with his knights toward the north. It was not a tactical withdrawal. It was not an orderly retreat. It was flight. The Earl of March followed him, and with them went the hope that the right flank could hold long enough for the king's center to do its work. In the center, David II still fought. The King of Scotland saw his flanks collapse. He saw the void where his nephew's army should have been, and despite everything, he did not flee, not immediately. He ordered the men surrounding him to stand firm. He continued commanding from within the battle with the desperation of one who knows the situation is irrecoverable but refuses to admit it. The roar of combat enveloped him. The English advanced from the flanks, from the front, from every possible direction. The Scottish formations in the center compressed upon themselves, unable to maneuver, unable to flee. That was when the arrows reached him. 2 arrows penetrated through the visor of his helmet, one in the left cheek, another deeper, near the jaw. The pain must have been brutal, blinding. Blood ran freely over the metal and leather of his armor. The men surrounding him, the last loyal warriors who had not fled, held him and tried to protect him. But the English army closed in on them like a wave that left no room to breathe. Only 40 men remained with the king. Only 40, where before there had been thousands. David II tried to withdraw. The field had become a mass of bodies, dust, and iron. The Scots who had not died fled toward the north, pursued by English cavalry. The king, wounded and surrounded, sought darkness, any place to hide while the chaos enveloping him allowed him to think. He found a bridge. Over the River Brownie, not far from the battlefield, there was a stone structure that offered shadow and concealment. David II hid beneath it. He was a king who hours earlier had marched at the head of thousands of men, convinced of his victory, heir to the man who had won Bannockburn. Now he was under a bridge, bleeding from the wounds on his face, listening to the footsteps of English soldiers searching for valuable prisoners. Legend says it was his own reflection that betrayed him. An English detachment searching for high-ranking fugitives passed near the bridge. One of the soldiers looked toward the calm waters of the Brownie and saw, in the river's reflection, the image of an armed man hidden under the structure. It was John de Couplan, a squire of relatively modest rank compared to the prisoner he was about to take. He approached with his soldiers. David II, wounded and cornered, tried to resist. He struck Coupland with such force that he broke 2 of his teeth, but they were too many. The King of Scotland was taken prisoner under a stone bridge, with arrows still lodged in his face and the blood of defeat mixed with the cold water of the river. The last 40 soldiers who had accompanied him to the end were killed or captured in the following minutes. The Scottish royal standard, the lion rampant on a gold background, was torn from the field. The pursuit began without delay. The English threw themselves after the defeated Scottish army through the northern roads. The cavalry rode for more than 20 miles, catching up with fugitives on the roads, at river fords, at the edges of forests. Those who could not pay a ransom were executed on the spot. The common soldiers, most of them, had no better luck than that. The ground between Durham and the Scottish border was left sown with the dead and abandoned, with armour cast aside and banners forgotten in the cold October mud. When the sun began to sink behind the hills northwest of Durham, the battlefield of Neville's Cross was a landscape of devastating stillness. The wind carried the scent of iron and damp earth. Ravens had begun to appear on the surrounding hills, black silhouettes against the grey evening sky, claiming their share of the disaster. The English counted their dead. They were few, surprisingly few for the magnitude of the battle, the result of having fought on advantageous ground with the superiority of the archers. On the Scottish side, the numbers were much darker. Around 3,000 Scots had died in the battle or in the pursuit. More than 50 great lords and nobles had been killed or captured. The flower of the Scottish military aristocracy had disappeared in a single afternoon. The Constable of Scotland, Lord David de la Haye, had died on the field. The Marshal, Robert de Keith, as well. The Chamberlain, John de Roxburgh. The Chancellor, Lord Thomas Charteris. The Earls of Moray and Strathern. Niall Bruce of Carrick, bastard son of the great Robert the Bruce. Men who had been the pillars of the kingdom, the structure upon which the government of Scotland rested, had fallen on the hills west of Durham. And David II was taken under escort toward the south. His wounds were treated with care, because a live prisoner king was worth infinitely more than a dead prisoner king. The arrows were extracted from his face. Bandages covered the wounds. But the pain that no bandage could cover was another, that of a king who had gambled his nation's fate and lost in an afternoon. John de Coupland, the squire who had captured him, was rewarded with a generosity that reflected the magnitude of the prize. Edward III elevated him to a knight and granted him a considerable annual income. A king was the greatest possible treasure in the political economy of medieval warfare. The consequences of Neville's Cross unfolded over Scotland for decades. David II was sent to England and confined in Odiham Castle in Hampshire. He would remain there for 11 years, separated from his kingdom, turned into a piece on the political chessboard that his captors would move with patience and calculation. The government of Scotland fell into the hands of the regent, the same Robert Stewart who had abandoned the field at Neville's Cross, and who, with astonishing political skill, would benefit precisely from the catastrophe he had partly helped to create. Edward III offered to release David II on 3 separate occasions in exchange for the Scottish king accepting one of the English monarch's sons as heir to the throne of Scotland. All 3 times the offer was rejected. Scotland, even humbled and without a king in its territory, was not willing to pay that price. Finally, in 1357, 11 years after the battle, David II was released through the Treaty of Berwick. The agreed ransom was 100,000 marks, an astronomical sum to be paid over 10 years. For an already poor kingdom that had lost its entire military leadership at Neville's Cross, the burden was crushing. The necessary taxes generated resentment and internal tensions that would mark Scottish politics for decades. The truce that accompanied the ransom payment forbade any Scottish citizen from taking up arms against Edward III during the payment period. That truce turned out to be, in practice, the conclusion of the Second War of Scottish Independence. 4 decades of relative peace opened between the two kingdoms, a peace forced by debt and defeat, but peace nonetheless. In the year following the battle, the English invaded the north and occupied practically the entire region south of the River Forth. The structure that Robert the Bruce had built with such sacrifice was subjected to a pressure that took years to alleviate. And yet Scotland survived. The kingdom's identity, forged in generations of resistance, did not dissolve. David II returned to his kingdom in 1357 and ruled for 14 more years, attempting to rebuild what the afternoon of October 17th had destroyed. When he died in 1371, without legitimate offspring, it was that same Robert Stewart who succeeded him as Robert II, inaugurating the dynasty that would carry Scotland's destiny on its shoulders for the following centuries. The name of the battle was etched in stone. Ralph Neville paid for a new cross to be erected on the spot where the combat had been fought, a cross to remember that day when the English army of the north, without the king, without the great knights sent to France with their own resources and their own determination, had stopped an invasion and captured a king. The cross was destroyed in 1589 by those who did not want the stone to continue remembering an enemy's triumph. But the name outlived the stone. On the hill west of Durham, where the cathedral still rises over the horizon like a promise of permanence, history left one of its harshest lessons. Kingdoms do not fall only by the strength of the enemy. They fall also by the pride of those who rule them, by alliances signed under pressure without calculating their consequences, by the flanks that are abandoned in the darkest moment, by kings who advance without seeing the ground they will tread. David II saw at Neville's Cross the reflection of his own image in the River Brownie, and that reflection betrayed him. Perhaps it was inevitable. Perhaps everything he had done since crossing the border that first day of October led inexorably toward that stone bridge, toward that still river, toward that image of himself in the water that turned the son of Scotland's most famous man into the prisoner of an English squire. Scotland lost in a single afternoon, and for decades it continued to pay the price of that afternoon. But Scotland did not disappear, and perhaps that is the final lesson the field of Neville's Cross teaches those who stop to listen, that kingdoms that survive their worst defeats find in that survival a form of victory more lasting than any battle won in a single day.